you for inviting me. I want to speak today about the topic of restoring or reviving historic towns and villages. Try that again. Talk about these issues from the point of view of efforts in the United States. And the first thing to say about that is that there are very few villages in the Chinese sense in the United States. There are a few that were left behind by railroads or their agricultural industries failed. Most of the survivors are in fact connected with particular religious groups. Otherwise, historic villages in the U.S. are figments of nostalgic imagination for most Americans. They're connected with an idyllic rural past. For most Americans, the encounter with villages would be at something like you see on the screen, that is, artificial villages, villages called outdoor museums, where traditional buildings from a variety of localities have been brought together into a semblance of an old village. And they go by names such as Old Bedford Village, which you see here, or Old Sturbridge Village, or Old World, Wisconsin. The first thing that we need to understand this history in the United States is that historic preservation, the recognition of ordinary villages, ordinary architecture, have their roots in American nationalism in the 19th century. And that has continued to shape the ways that people have looked at the architecture of the past, and particularly connection with the American Revolution. So that at first people looked at individual buildings, and then as the 20th century approached, they began to look at villages and towns. Under this overarching nationalist agenda, one that sometimes was explicitly connected, as we'll see, to particular political ideologies, we might look at four ways that people have treated these kinds of vernacular landscapes. And the first is treating the vernacular as a relic. In 1850, the state of New York bought this house, the Habsburg House, a mid-18th century house that was, because it was used as George Washington's last military headquarters during the Revolution. And that's very characteristic of the way the traditional landscape has been preserved, particularly at the beginning. That is, they didn't care that this was a fairly rare example of a pre-revolutionary house built by descendants of people from the Rhineland, from Huguenots. They cared that it was a relic of George Washington. Sometimes relics were also preserved to honor ancestors, to preserve the memories of one's own hardy pioneer ancestors who were seen as the people who created the spirit that eventually led to the revolution. This is the remains of a village in New Paltz, New York, just a few miles from Washington's headquarters. These houses built by some of the relatives of the person who built the last house. They're now preserved by the descendants of the families who originally lived in them. And they also are, from the scholarly point of view, are excellent examples because they were preserved so early, relatively unaltered examples of very rare vernacular house types. But that wasn't the point of preserving them in the first place. The point of preserving them in the first place was a form of ancestor worship. The second approach that people have taken toward this kind of architecture, we might call pictorial or visual. In the 19th century, architects and antiquarians in America were influenced by 18th century European ideas about history, about culture, about aesthetics, ideas that treated architecture as intimately connected to differences in time and place and culture. That is, they began to move away from a notion that all architecture should be a particular ideal, and to understand that architecture grew out of time, place, circumstance. So one of the first attempts to write the history of world architecture was the book from which two images are displayed on the screen by an Austrian architect who drew, for the most part, when he drew Asian architecture, his imagination, how he imagined Asian architecture to look. But he acknowledged that there were other kinds of architecture than European architecture, and that they were interesting. That ties into nationalism in the sense that you begin to look for architecture that seems to be characteristic of your society, of your country. So, and you begin to look at that visually. So architects and antiquarians in 19th century U.S. began to see houses like the Hasbrouck House we just looked at as visually interesting, as well as communicating through visual qualities important insights about the past, about ancestors, about past events. So here's a drawing made by a famous American architect in the 19th century named Stanford White. He and two colleagues in the year 1876, the year of the centennial of the American Revolution, traveled around the northeastern United States and drew pictures of interesting old buildings that were connected with important events of the past, but also buildings that simply looked exotic, looked ancient, looked different from the buildings that they were used to. So they saw these buildings as somehow, in some almost mystical way, embodying the struggles, the values, the individual characters of the people who lived them, conveying important messages to the present. And they drew these for two reasons. One was that they wanted to use, for these patriotic reasons. The other was that they were looking for inspiration for architectural design at the present. They saw these buildings through the lens of a picturesque 18th century architectural theory that had much of which was indebted to Europeans' understanding or misunderstanding of Chinese gardening principles. But picturesque was a fondness for things that looked irregular, things that looked different from place to place, things that looked exotic, things that looked as though they had suffered the effects of time and therefore conveyed their age in their appearance. Things that simply conveyed visual variety, so that as one traveled from place to place, one saw different sorts of buildings. So in that sense, they conveyed the kind of atmosphere, the kind of ambiance that these architects thought were valuable. The third approach we might call the vernacular, the ordinary architecture, as a reproach to industrialism. Again, other architects and many artists in the late 19th century began to value the products of the pre-industrial period. They began to think of industrial products, industrial labor as oppressive, as producing bad design, cheap design, and so they looked to the pre-industrial for examples of what came from good craftsmanship, from committed craftsmanship, from people who knew what they were doing and were committed to something, to making something that would last. And they saw this as a rebuke to the shoddiness and the oppressiveness of the industrial order. The first books of what we would call vernacular architecture in the United States came out of this way of looking at things. Two architects, Norman Isham and Albert Brown, wrote a book about the state of Rhode Island in 1895. They wrote a book about the state of Connecticut in 1900. And they stressed, as you can see from these images, they stressed the workmanship of pre-industrial builders. And in fact, they dedicated both books to the historic craftsmen of those periods. The first book in England that looked at these kinds of architectural phenomena came out about 20 years earlier, and there the author said, "I boldly put forward these foreign as subjects to crib from," meaning copy from. "All the bad work of today springs from the vanity or the laziness that scorns to found itself on the experience of others, and the good work obviously closely follows old examples." So they're holding out the architecture of the pre-industrial past as something that, if we pay attention to it, it can cure the ills of contemporary architecture. The fourth way of looking at these kinds of buildings is to see it as the architecture of true Americans, the people, in the sense of Renmi, as the lower classes, farmers, and so on, as being real Americans. This arises in the 20s and 30s with the Depression. It rises out of the socioeconomic conflict of that era, conflicts between city dwellers and rural people, conflicts between workers and capitalists, conflicts between communists and related groups and right-wing groups. And all of these conflicts generate a valorization, a promotion of people, whoever that group might be, as the true holders of American values. The Communist Party in the 1930s organized something called the Popular Front, which promoted cultural expressions that celebrated ordinary people. These are two very famous American images from that period. Grant Wood's painting American Gothic, which shows a very dour-looking farm couple in front of their vernacular Gothic house. And Walker Evans was a photographer who, in the 30s, set out to photograph the ordinary landscape of America, and he shows a group of men sitting in front of a very undistinguished looking building, very characteristic kind of image of that period. And when we move to these kinds of images, we move away from the necessarily valorization, necessary clinging to the pre-industrial. Now the ordinary landscape, the landscape of that's simply non-official and non-monumental becomes something worth looking at. And that attitude continues into the 1960s and beyond with the formal growth of vernacular architecture studies at a time when the African American freedom struggle is going on, and historians and anthropologists and architectural historians, geographers, folklorists, all become committed for political reasons to the architecture and the landscapes of ordinary people. So by the beginning of the 20th century, American vernacular landscapes begin to be seen as something worth celebrating in their own right. You get the first professional efforts to present them in museums. In 1915, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the largest art museum in the United States, created something called the American Wing. This is an image from their catalog when it was first founded. A room from a 17th century vernacular house. They brought the interior, they destroyed the house to get it. They furnished it with furniture of the same period. These period rooms, as they were called, are very unrealistic in the sense that no one living in any house at any time would have furniture, architecture, household goods, all from the same period and the same style. So these rooms are really presented officially as art galleries. They're edited in a way that brings out the visual qualities of one particular period, but people who visit these rooms tend to see them as attempting to present how people really lived. So the curators would just say, this is a collection of objects. People who visit the museum would think, well, this is how people in the 17th century lived. These rooms have a very explicit political and cultural didactic intent. This is a time when the United States is being flooded with large numbers of people from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, Asia, and they're seen by the kind of people who make these museums as somehow threatening to American values. And so the book that this image was in says, by coming to look at these rooms, people from other countries will realize that our values are better, that somehow these objects will teach them what the curators think of as the correct American values. So the key to that, both aesthetically and didactically, and a key to what I want to say, is that you do that by editing. You do that by cutting out everything that seems to interfere with the message, cutting out images, cutting out objects that might be of other periods or other uses to try to purify the message. And when you do that, you erase the sense of historical process, of how things change. You erase the sense of socioeconomic context. And what you give people are a series of isolated snapshots, something that British colonizers in the 19th century used to call object lessons. By looking at this object, you learn something we want you to learn. So all these ways of looking at individual buildings and objects at the beginning of the 20th century begin to be concentrated on, it turned on entire landscapes, entire villages or towns, not just isolated villages. And again, this comes out of a nationalist agenda with particular political undertones. One of the first and most famous is the attempt to revive picturesque, outdated cities, such as Charleston, South Carolina, that you see here on the southeast coast of the United States. It's a southern city. At the time of the American Revolution, it was one of the 5 largest cities in America. It was the major port for importing enslaved Africans in the 18th and 19th century. After the Civil War, it died. In the early 20th century, local people began to say, how can we generate tourism? How can we bring people back to Charleston, make money? And they revived it based on a mythology of what life was like before the Civil War. Like the period room, they created an edited landscape, a landscape in which signs of trade and commerce were erased. So this row of commercial warehouses on the waterfront that you see on the left becomes a row of brightly painted single-family houses that you see on the right, called Rainbow Row, for obvious reasons. Most important, they erased signs of the African-American presence that was the whole point of the city. Removing this part of the United States was one of the most heavily African-American in the country. The old portion of Charleston was a mixture not only of elite residences, but of slave quarters, houses of free black people, people who built the city, people who performed most of the labor there. After the Civil War, these people were peons, essentially, living in alleys and around richer people to work for them. These are erased. Spaces like the ones you see on the left, completely demolished in order to give you a pristine, clean, white landscape that both literally and figuratively. This was very much part of an implied political argument, an argument about the nature of life in a slave society. And that vision is still exceptionally popular among visitors today. So we might say that Charleston was edited with a pictorial eye for the way it would look, to emphasize the relics of the slaveholding class and their living descendants and admirers, and to erase all signed to the black presence and black labor that made it work and gave it its existence in the first place. So I want to spend a little time on one particular restored village that shows in the way it was transformed over the past several years, past 90 years, the ways that these ideas keep coming up. And that city is Williamsburg, Virginia. Many of you have probably heard of it. It was the colonial capital of Virginia, a colony with almost no urban development. In 1780, the capital was moved to Richmond, and Williamsburg died. In the early 20th century, a local clergyman tried successfully to convince the oil tycoon, John D. Rockefeller Jr., to invest in the conversion of this town to a museum on the grounds, again, that it was intimately connected to the American Revolution. What you see here is Williamsburg in 1927, just before work began on it. The numbered buildings are the buildings that were kept. Everything else you see in this image was edited, meaning demolished, leaving what they called 88 original buildings. But it had a very strange definition of an original building. An original building could be a completely altered building that had X number of bricks still surviving in it. But those were the sacred 88. We want to trace the changes in these attitudes by looking at three key publications over this 90 years. In 1935, a professional magazine, the Architectural Record, published this special issue to celebrate the completion of the first stage of restoration. And when we look at that issue, we see that the first restoration of Williamsburg is primarily pictorial, visual. They're thinking, they have in their minds a preconceived idea of what gracious living in the southern colonial period should look like, and so they make the building look like that. In fact, if you look in the archives, you'll see that they made full-size mock-ups of several species of trees and moved them up and down the streets to see where they look best. So they're entirely thinking of looking. They're attempting to create this visual representation of a mid-18th century town. You can see here what it looked like, the main street looked like in 1925 and what it looks like now. So most of the research was about architectural details that were intended to support the restoration or about the biographies of individual residents of these buildings. But Williamsburg also was restored by architects. Many of them were actually modernist architects. One of them was the first American to go to the mountains. The architectural firm in charge, Perry, Shaw, and Hepburn, also worked with Alvar Aalto. So what they saw in the town were the design principles. They argued that Williamsburg was a kind of intuitive representation of the kinds of design principles that modern architecture preferred. So let's jump to the second publication, the 18th century houses of Williamsburg, there was also a book about public buildings of Williamsburg at the same time, product of that by that time of 3 decades of research on the site. And here that architects' ideas of architectural principles come to the fore. The architects were trying to place these relatively small houses in Williamsburg in the great tradition of the European Renaissance. So they showed drawings like this that stressed the proportional systems. As they said, organize these buildings just as they organized Renaissance palaces. They thought that the city was an oasis of high culture in Virginia. So one of the concrete manifestations of that, again, if you look at the archives, you see that when the architects wanted to go more than 3 or 4 miles from the city for architectural research, they had to write a long justification because nothing outside the city was seen to be relevant. These people also partake of that 19th century interest in architectural craft or technology to a certain extent. Not as deeply as the 19th century people did, but it's there. And that comes to the fore in the most recent phase of the museum's research. Since the 1970s, this interest in the craft of building has been directed toward understanding the evolution of the architecture in the entire region. Now people understand that it's all connected, that Williamsburg, the ideas in Williamsburg architecture don't die within 3 or 4 miles. So they see it in the context of the entire southern coast of what's now the United States. They see it in the context of all sorts of buildings, not just houses of the elite, but agricultural buildings, commercial buildings, slave buildings. They see it in buildings used by the elite, by the building sort, by slaves, because their interest in this kind of history is an interest in our first sense of vernacular, and that is that these are environments that shape and reproduce social relationships and everyday lives of everyone. The idea is to present the museum as Carrie Carson, who was the director of research at that time, wrote in an article, "Living Museums of Every Man's History." That we're looking not just at what the slaveholders or the leaders of the revolution lived like. We want to know how everybody in this town lived. So you see in these 3 examples the way that a whole variety of ideas about heritage and architectural restoration have shaped this one museum village over the course of 90 years. And I don't want to present this as a progressive series, and it gets better and better, because it's actually very idiosyncratic. But this project has produced a great deal of very valuable research about life in small villages like this in the pre-industrial South. But under it all is this nationalistic ideology. The orientation for a film at Colonial Williamsburg is called The Story of a Patriot. They still stress the connection with the American Revolution. And even every man's history is supposed to support a more democratic image of how the American Revolution came out. The sad final chapter of this is that 2 months ago, Williamsburg got a new administration, and they abolished their entire research program. There's no longer any historians or architectural historians working there. They fired all the staff, and so this Chesapeake House book is kind of tombstone for what Colonial Williamsburg has done. They now have amusement park-like features like musket shooting ranges, and the pop star Ozzy Osbourne is filming a series there. A sad story. So even though my story has been about museum villages and museums, it touches in a kind of highlighted way on broader issues about preserving and restoring and revitalizing villages or small towns. It raises the question, what is it that these villages and landscapes tell us? What are their values for the present? In America, you get contradictory and kind of confused answers, partly because that contradiction and confusion is built into the fundamental law of historic preservation in the United States, the 1966 Historic Preservation Act, which confuses, which leaves ambiguous the difference between historically important, and I put that as quotes, historically important buildings and landscapes, meaning the relics, places that where famous people lived or worked, or famous events happened, or simply the oldest or the first or the biggest, the best, and on the other hand, an emphasis on environment, a belief that the ordinary, vernacular, historic landscape is good for present-day people psychologically, politically, civically, physically, that it's good to be around an older landscape. So one emphasizes this kind of loosely patriotic thing, and the other is a kind of psychological, environmental issue. Those things constantly come into conflict. That leads to a prevalence in the United States of what are called historic districts within cities and towns, certain areas that are defined as somehow resembling or retaining the characteristics of the past, but also the unfortunate idea of what's called in the official jargon intrusions. Some sort of date is defined after which history is cut off. So this building, the two buildings on the left are historic buildings. The building on the right is an intrusion, even even though it's part of the history of that neighborhood. So again, we have this idea of editing built into the Historic Preservation Act. What I would suggest, though, is that we think of, outside of museums, we think about villages and so on as living places. We realize, we understand that continuity is more important than what's called in America integrity, more important than taking something back. Policies that allow residents to choose what kinds of changes they will make and to choose at what pace they will make them are better than attempts either to freeze historic landscapes in a particular time, or even worse, to take them back to another time. That the image on the top of the Bowery in New York is inherently a more interesting image than the image on the top of an artificially created landscape of the past. Thank you.